slavery and asked the question, was slavery economically productive or inefficient? And how did this affect the rest of the country? So whenever you study this type of question, you have to be careful to ask the right question, make sure you're looking at the information that with a good methodology that will provide you an accurate answer as to reality. And so economics is the study of human action living in the world that we live in, which is a world of what is called scarcity. Scarcity means that there are limits on everything that we experience. There are limits on time, there are limits on money, there are limits on energy, there are limits on resources, and that causes us to have to make choices about how to do the things that we want to do in order to satisfy our wants and needs. And so within that situation, that comes to the economics of the system of slavery. Now, we've looked at and talked about quite a bit the injustice of slavery, but the question that we're dealing with today is, was slavery productive? Is slavery a system that leads to and creates wealth and prosperity? Is slavery a system that is efficient? You can think about the fact that slavery is forced labor of another human being through violence or the threat of violence. And obviously, slavery must have some productivity. It has to produce something, or else there would be no reason to have slavery other than cruelty. So we have to think through, okay, then who benefited from slavery and who did not benefit from slavery? Because forcing someone to work for free without their agreement or consent brings a certain amount of benefits, but it also comes with a certain amount of costs. You could imagine what it would be like if somebody kidnapped you and was going to force you to work. All the costs that they would have to incur basically to make you do things that you did not want to do. And they would have to use time and energy and resources to make sure that they watched you, didn't let you escape, kept you alive and at least healthy enough to do the things that they were wanting, and then have somebody to watch over you and force you to make sure that you got the work done. All those things come with costs versus somebody who is hired for money or something else, but hired voluntarily by their agreement and consent, and they trade their labor for something that they want more, which is usually money. They give up their time and energy and their labor in order to receive some benefit that they want more. Now, some historians claim that slavery was a net economic benefit to everyone except the slaves, meaning everyone, because of the complexity of a slave economy that was tied into certain products all over the country and all over the world, that the whole system of wealth generated during that time and afterward was all centered on top of slavery. And that everyone benefited from slavery except the slaves. So the claim is that slavery was efficient and productive. And along with that often is the claim that slavery produced the growth and wealth of the modern economy. In other words, that the economy of the United States and growth that America has seen, especially over the last 200 years, is really as a result of the production of slavery. But we have to ask a very important economic question. It's not just enough to ask, did slavery produce some economic output? We have to ask the economic question of compared to what? Is slavery productive compared to what? Because if you compare slavery or slave labor to nothing, to zero labor whatsoever, then yes, slavery would look to be economically productive, because slave labor is more productive than no labor or nothing. But if you compare slave labor to other things, like free labor, for example, or the use of technology or machinery or that type of technological advancement, that's another type of question. Is slavery as productive, less productive, or more productive than free labor? Now, in order to look at this, we would have to look at the value of output, meaning if you had or were a slave, how much work could you produce in one day? If your job is to pick cotton or tobacco or something of that nature, and you're maybe allowed to use tools or certain things to help you do that, but you basically have to, against your will, work to produce a certain amount of economic output. So, and then remember, different people can do different things. If somebody's stronger or more skilled, they could produce more or less output, depending on what type of job was being required. So to calculate the productivity of slavery, you look at the value of the economic output minus the costs of using slavery. And what are the costs of using slavery? Well, the costs that go into using slavery, and there may be more than these, but these were the ones I had to think of, are subsistence. In order to have slavery, you have to provide at least some level of subsistence, which means you have to keep people fed, clothed, sheltered, and alive long enough, and with some type of health care or something if they get hurt or injured. You would have to keep that going long enough to continue to make them work. That's a cost. Now, it may not be very much or very good, but it's required as part of the system. It's a cost that goes into the system. It also requires maintenance. That if somebody gets hurt, as I said, or sick or injured, and they cannot produce any labor for that day or set of days, then that is another cost. It also requires management, someone to teach how to do the job and oversee that the job is done. Because if somebody, for example, took me as a slave, they'd have to force me to do the job and then make sure that I was actually doing it. And they may not want to watch me, so they may have to hire someone else to watch me and make sure that I do it. They also have to have the costs of enforcement, making sure that not only that I work, but that I don't run away. And if I do, that they have to give up the costs to catch me. All of these costs added up together. The question is whether the value of slave labor outweighs all of these costs incurred by using slave labor. Is it economically even worth it to use slave labor given all these costs, or do the costs make it prohibitively expensive? But this calculation, value of output minus all these things, equals the net labor produced. So the normal calculation of output with capital goods, like tools or machines, like a lawnmower, would have some of these things. You'd have to have some type of subsistence maintenance of a lawnmower, but it wouldn't come with enforcement costs. For the simple fact that if I was a slave, I could run away. That's a risk, that's a cost that's involved. Whereas if there's a lawnmower, the lawnmower does not run away. That's a capital good. It's not a human good used in slave labor. Now, is slavery cheap labor? We may think, okay, slavery is the cheapest labor there ever could be because you don't have to pay them. Because if somebody takes me and enslaves me, they will not be paying me. They will be forcing me to work through violence or the threat of violence. Therefore, my wages as a slave would be zero. So we would think slave labor versus hiring someone, that slave labor must, by definition, be cheaper because they're being paid $0 an hour. However, remember that slavery comes with costs that free labor may or may not come with. Free labor does not come with enforcement costs and other such things. So, for example, during this same time period, during 1850, when slavery was at its height in the United States, an Indian day labor in the country of India could work for $15.80 a year. Now that's very low, especially given our modern time. But this is some of the cheapest free labor in the world. Indian day laborers were making $15.80 a year. Well, how much did slavery cost relative to that? 1/4 to 1/2 of the annual cost of food, housing, and medical care and clothing for American slaves. So, in other words, slavery was at least doubly expensive, or sometimes even 4 times as expensive as the cheapest free labor on earth during that time. Because 1/4 of that, or 1/2 of that, would be the yearly cost for slavery of food, housing, medical care, and clothing in the United States. So the cheapest labor in the world during that time, free labor in the world during that time, was cheaper than slavery by about at least half, sometimes 4 times as cheap. Sometimes people did not own slaves. It was only a wealthy few, relatively, who could afford to own slaves for life, to actually purchase slaves. But around 1850, the annual maintenance for slaves was about $30 to $61 a year. Which meant that free labor was actually cheaper than slave labor. The abolitionist James Cropper in 1823 said this. He goes, in a densely populated district like that of the Bengal, India, said where wages are reduced to the lowest rate of subsistence, where can be the profit or motive for holding men in slavery? So basically, this abolitionist James Cropper makes the point that slavery is actually more expensive than the cheapest free labor on earth. Slavery was actually multiple times more expensive than free labor. And therefore, slavery did not make economic sense overall as a system of production because costs could be saved by using cheaper free labor rather than slavery. Plus, there wouldn't be the enforcement costs and all the other things that would come along with using slave labor as well. So, why did they continue to use slavery if it was many times more expensive than free labor? Well, it's around this time, remember, that slavery starts to change and break down, and that places in the world are starting to bring slavery to an end for exactly this reason, because slavery becomes more expensive and prohibitively more expensive. Now, it remains for a while because it benefits a wealthy few people who continue to benefit from the system at the expense of everyone else. So in economics, there's what is called an opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the foregone alternative of a given action. In other words, it's very simple. We make this decision all the time that we give up things in order to get other things. So if you sleep another 30 minutes, you get 30 minutes more of sleep, but you had to give up doing other stuff during that time. And so opportunity cost is the things that we give up in order to get the main thing that we want at a given time. And so what is given up when a choice is made? So look at the rental of slaves. Some people didn't buy slaves, they rented slaves. And the annual hire rate in the lower South around 1850, meaning the yearly amount that it would cost to rent a slave for a year in the lower South, was $168 a year. Now, this would include a rental fee, maintenance, meaning you'd have to feed, even if it wasn't good, feed, clothe, shelter, and provide some type of health care. And then you would have to provide you'd have to pay for insurance, because if a slave was being used for labor, they could get hurt, they could get sick, they could get injured, or they could run away. And therefore, you had to pay an insurance fee on slaves. And or if you were in the position of the slave, this is all the costs that it would require to enslave you. So the total amount for a year for somebody to rent someone and force them into slave labor in 1850 in the lower South United States was $198 total. Now, that doesn't sound very much to us, but remember that money then is adjusted now for inflation. But this was 10 times higher than the cost of labor in India, free labor in India. In other words, if you compare the slave labor to the cheapest free labor of the time, slavery was 10 times more expensive than free labor, which means that slavery was not a productive economic system when we compare it to free labor even of the time. Slavery was very economically unproductive and terrible for an economy because it reduced the potential for the economy, as well as the main point of what we talked about before, it was an injustice. But both of those factors, the injustice of slavery plus the fact that slavery didn't make economic sense anymore, started to work against the system of slavery toward bringing it to an end.